It seems like just about everyone has a strong opinion about what's right and wrong with public education in the United States. We hear heated debates everywhere about the purposes of education and competing agendas for how to reform or transform it. On one end of the spectrum, there's a dominant narrative, a corporate education agenda that's backed by government policies and wealthy funders and promotes standardized testing and curriculum, school privatization, attacks on ethnic studies, union busting, zero-tolerance behavior policies, and much more that we'll be talking about throughout Flashpoints education series in the weeks ahead. On the other side of the continuum is growing resistance to these narratives, blossoming movements for anti-oppressive, culturally relevant, and socially just education. But these debates and struggles did not begin in the 20th century with President George Bush or his corporate friends or with their No Child Left Behind policies. In fact, there have been competing paradigms and worldviews since the European colonizers, the slave traders, and the settlers invaded the indigenous peoples of this continent and set up shop on the land that we now call North America. Today we'll look more closely at these competing paradigms and their impacts, both historically and currently. And to help us do that, we are excited and we're honored to be joined by Dr. Leroy Littlebear, a member of the Blackfoot Confederacy. Dr. Littlebear is the former director of the American Indian Program at Harvard University and professor emeritus of Native Studies at the University of Lethbridge in Canada, where he was department chair for 25 years. He has served as a legal and constitutional advisor to the Assembly of First Nations and has served on many influential committees, commissions, and boards dealing with First Nations issues. Dr. Littlebear joins us by telephone from his home in Alberta, Canada. Leroy Littlebear, welcome to Flashpoints, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me on your show.
Okay, cool. What is important for us to know about you, who you are, and the work that you have been doing in education over these decades?
Well, first of all, I think the most, what is important is that I grew up as a Blackfoot Indian, a member of the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot Confederacy, in fact, straddles the American-Canada border. And our territory, traditional territory, went from Yellowstone River, in Montana, way up north up to Edmonton on the North Saskatchewan River, and all along the, continental divide of the Rockies over, quite far into the northern plains, into what is now eastern Montana and back down to Yellowstone. That was traditional Blackfoot territory. And so I grew up speaking my language. I grew up on the reservation. And you have always, spent most of my time now, my adult years, in the area of higher education. I've been at the University of Lethbridge since 1975, except for those 2 years or so at Harvard.
All right. Thank you for that. And when dominant culture talks about the history of public education in the United States, the conversation often begins with the establishment of the first schools by European settlers and their descendants. Can you take us on a more honest historical journey? How did indigenous cultures think about education before the arrival of European colonizers, slave traders, and settlers?
Well, if we were to just take a step back and ask, what is education? Okay? Mm-hmm. Well, education is basically the handing down of the collective knowledge of a particular society to the youth, to the newborn, to the younger generation. And this is done so that the younger people, when they grow up, will end up carrying on the traditions, the customs, the beliefs, and so on. Now, any society, and every society, we can say, has a culture. And I prefer to refer to culture as a collective agreement. In other words, people come together and say, hey, this is how we are going to view the world. This is what our beliefs are going to be, and so on. And we're going to, proceed with certain ways of doing things, etc. So, in other words, every culture or collective agreement consists of a philosophy or paradigms. And secondly, it consists of customs. In other words, customs are the accepted ways of doing things. And lastly, a culture consists of values. This is social values. And those values really speak to, the values are incentives for the members of a society to adhere to the customs and beliefs of the society. In other words, hey, if you follow our ways and our beliefs, you will be rewarded. You will get recognition. See, that's what values do. Because if we didn't give people incentives, well, then everybody might be going every which way and joining another group, another society, and so on. So the intent of values is to make the group adhere to the beliefs and the customs. So, what is the philosophy or paradigms of Native Americans? Okay, well, it consists of several aspects. The first aspect is what we refer to as the native mind revolves around what we call constant flux, constant motion. In other words, we view the world as always moving. Now, for comparison purposes, in Western thought, the world is static and it's fixed. And probably the best example of that is the notion that Einstein came up with: God does not play dice with the universe. This is the way it is. I always refer to Walter Cronkite, remember at the end of his newscasts, used to say, this is the way it is?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. See, and so we tend, in Western thought, we tend to view the world as static. Okay? Whereas in the native world, it's always movement. And it's, it's similar to quantum physics. Quantum physics talks about constant motion. Okay? The next aspect of the native thought is that this flux that we're talking about, in other words, existence, consists of energy waves. All right? Okay. Now, in Western thought, it's really about matter. In physics, for instance, they talk about subatomic particles. And they're always looking for the most primary of those particles. And so we keep coming down smaller and smaller from, atom down to electrons, down to quarks and neutrinos and so on. See, but in native thought, it's really about energy waves. Okay? The next aspect of the native paradigm is everything is animate. Everything is full of life. In other words, everything is made up of those energy waves. Combinations of energy waves makes for all of existence. Say, whereas in Western thought, hey, you and I might be animate, those animals might be animate, but we start to, hesitate to give life to plants, let's say, and rocks definitely are inanimate, say. So, but in Blackfoot thought, let's say, hey, even those rocks are alive, and I can relate to them as such. Another aspect of Native thought is that everything is related. Everything, is interrelated. Whereas in Western thought, we approach things by isolating things. We have a very reductionist way of looking at things. All right? The next part of it is that everything, needs to be renewed. It's about renewal, okay? And because there seems to be an unstated realization that these particular energy waves that make for our existence may change. In other words, the flux that we refer to may change, and will get consumed and will disappear into the flux. Not that the energy waves are going to disappear, it's just that that particular combination of energy waves will no longer be there. Okay?
Okay.
So, in other words, just think of Neanderthal man. Where is he? He used to be our neighbor, but he's not around anymore. What about the dinosaurs? They used to rule the world, but they're not around anymore. In other words, things changed, a different combination of energy waves, and their continuing existence slowly dissipated. Say. So, which begins to say that, hey, we need to renew those conditions that make for our continuing existence. Right?
Okay.
Now, second to the last aspect is, of course, land. Even though land is part of the flux and even the land changes, as we are seeing with global warming, and but it's a good reference point. See, it's a good reference point, at least for the time being. That's why the notion of land is very important in the minds of Native Americans. Okay?
Okay.
Whereas Westerners, the main referent in their mind is time, see, as opposed to place. Okay? And lastly, the languages are different in the sense that English, for instance, is very noun-oriented, and whereas Blackfoot, Navajo is very process-oriented, action-oriented, see? And those paradigms make for a totally different way of looking at reality, what is real out there, okay, what we would refer to as reality. So, when we're talking about education, it begins to say that Westerners approach education, for instance, from a non-renewal basis. So in other words, if you're in grade 1 and you've done grade 1. Okay, now we're in grade 3, let's say, and then you forget how to do a particular math problem or something. What does your teacher say to you? The teacher says to you, "Oh, you should have known that. We taught you that. You were taught back that particular problem and on how to do it in grade 2, in grade 1." See?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, been there, done, did it.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it's fixed.
Whereas in native thought, coming back to the notion of renewal, knowledge has to be renewed all the time. It's like love. Love has to be renewed all the time. The example I give about that, using love as an analogy, is, you could see a young couple, for instance, that had been married and is still, in the honeymoon period, but however long that honeymoon period lasts, over coffee in the morning one day, usually the wife, but not always, but usually the wife will say to her husband, "Hey, you know what? You have changed." Okay. And the husband, seeing something coming, says, "What do you mean I have changed?"
Mm-hmm.
And she says, "You know what? When we were dating, when we were courting, you used to bring me the flowers. You used to bring me the gifts. You don't do that anymore." And he says, "I married you, didn't I?" And see, but if you just stop there, say, what is the wife talking about? She's talking about renewal.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Whereas the guy is talking about a one-shot thing.
Mm-hmm.
I married you, didn't I?
Mm-hmm.
See? So that's in that same sense that love has to be renewed, knowledge has to be renewed. See? And so that's one aspect of the public education system. It's been on the approaches, hey, been there, done, did it, let's move on.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Native people's approach would be, hey, we have to renew this. We have to tell the stories over again. We have to do the same ceremony. That's why, we do the same ceremonies year in and year out. We tell the same stories. We sing the same songs. That's part of renewal. See, and that's non-existent or almost non-existent in the present education system because we're coming at this notion of handing down knowledge to the younger generation from a very different angle, from a very different perspective. And those perspectives are brought about by these paradigms that Western society has and what Native American societies have.
Wow.
See the picture?
I do. In a word, what I'm hearing is that there are different views of reality between Western and indigenous cultures that reflect different paradigms. And then that is basically reflected in everything from the language to education and everything else. Now, I wondered about the role of relationships in those paradigms. Is there also some difference in how the different cultures view relationships?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, in the native world, everything is related. So, for instance, we have large relational networks. When you probably have heard this, it's almost rhetorical now, all my relations.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. Well, when our elders and our ceremonialists are praying, they always refer to the all my relations, all our relations. And when they're talking about all our relations, they're not talking about humans. They're talking about those birds out there. They're talking about those trees out there. They're talking about the water, the fish, and so on, the stars, the sun. Those are all our relations because it is this particular combination of factors that all come together that make for our existence.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And, whereas in Western thought, well, all you have to do is go back to Genesis and the biblical stories where God made man, and everything else was made for the benefit of man.
Mm-hmm.
See, in the native worldview, hey, we're only a part. We're only a small part of the totality.
Mm-hmm.
See, whereas in the Western approach, hey, we're at the helm. We're the bosses.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes for a very different type of relationships. See, so in the social relationships, even in governmental relationships, we, in Western thought, it manifests itself in a very hierarchical way, and the guy up on top is the ultimate boss. Whereas in the native worldview, this manifests in kind of like equality. That's why everybody is always Native Americans are always associated with the circle, and everybody has to say their piece and so on. When we reach a consensus, okay, this is the way it's going to go. See, whereas, hey, Obama is going to make the decision on Keystone.
Mm-hmm. Right. I want to tie that idea to educational systems. If we were to extend that, for example, in the traditional Western paradigm of education, the teacher is the holder of all of the knowledge, basically. The students don't know anything and their heads are being passively filled. They're not the authorities. So in the indigenous views, who is it that holds the knowledge and who is it that renews the knowledge, particularly in the educational systems? Can you give me some sense of that?
Yeah. Well, see, in the Western view, as you've explained, is that the teacher is the holder of the knowledge, and they, the students just open their minds up, and the teacher pours it all in.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. Whereas in the native approach, it's really about lived experience. Okay, it's about lived experience. And so there's a deference given to what is normally referred to as elders, because they've lived long and they've had a whole bunch of experiences. And when they're teaching, or, when they start to, teachings of the elders, they never come down and say, this is the way it is. Mm-hmm. What they'll always tell you is, this is how I've experienced this. Mm. Here's my experience, and they'll tell you the story. Here's how I've experienced that other development, this other event, and so on. This is what I've experienced. Okay? Right. And that's what they relate, is the actual lived experience. Whereas in Western thought, hey, the teacher is the holder, and a large part of what is being taught is really propositional. You want me to explain that?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay. Well, probably the best explanation I can give is what the late Vine Deloria said, okay? And he uses the example that says, all men are mortal, okay? Mm-hmm. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Okay?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Now, that's a formula. That's a proposition.
Right.
Now, so for Western thinkers, that's sufficient. For a native thinker, what he will say is, yeah, I had met Socrates, and he's a man like me. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And I know that men are mortal, and so Socrates must be mortal too. You know, why would he say that? That's because he hasn't met all men.
Mm.
In other words, hey, there might be a situation where we meet an immortal man.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't met all men, so I cannot say all men are mortal.
Okay, so it's experience-based.
Yeah, but my present experience up to this point in time says, yeah, the people I have met are mortal.
Mm.
That would be the difference in thinking about this notion of a propositional approach in Western education as opposed to actual lived experience in Native American thinking.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, let me try and go back to where I started the question about the educational systems themselves that existed prior to the coming of European settlers. I mean, you address this a little bit in terms of like knowledge being renewed through constant songs and storytelling. Were there formal institutions like formal schools, or did it more happen in the community context? Talk to me a little about whether there was an institutionalized form of education as the Europeans.
When we say institutionalized, we're thinking about schools, public schools,
exactly.
colleges, universities.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And probably the closest that would come about, that would be similar, I should say, in the Native American world, would be situations, for instance, like this time of the year, during the winter, for instance, is when usually the grandmas, the grandpas, in other words, the elders, kind of would get younger people and the young children and so forth, and they would tell them stories. And in each of these stories, whether, for instance, they're trickster stories about coyote and so forth, about raven and so forth, they would tell them these stories. And then they would relate to them the meaning and the lessons being taught, behind each of those stories. So that would, if you want to say that is a institutional, that would probably be the closest, and so on in terms of formal type education. But a large part of it is also mentoring. The older people, the grandmas, the grandpas, and uncles, older people, relatives, and so on, would take younger people with them, whether, it was, one by one or as a group, and say, hey, let's go out and hunt. But in the process, it's not just running the deer down. It's not just running the game down, but they learn about all the topography of the land, the plants, and so on. What is it that these animals like to eat and so forth? This is where they're going to hang out and so forth. They learn all about that in the process of hunting. So it's by actual lived experience. It's by actual doing.
Right. That's a very different concept than the idea that education just exists in that classroom, and then when you leave that classroom,
Yeah.
There's not education.
And that's because, like we said, to a large extent, Western education is very propositionally based.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now,
And then it's only after we come out of school, out of the classrooms, then we say, well, let's see if we can apply this. Okay?
yeah, well, which is exactly why you hear so many kids in school say, why do I need to learn this? Because there's such a disconnect between what's happening in the classroom and what's
Right.
happening outside, right?
Yeah. So in other words, you know, in Western approaches to education, what we're doing is coming up with the proposition and then attempting to apply it afterwards. In the native world, we go through the experiences, and it's from these experiences that you maybe, can come up with a proposition.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Yeah, kind of the opposite way.
Right. All right. Let me go back a little bit to the history now. We have these conflicting paradigms, we have these conflicting worldviews, and of course, we also have the whole process of colonization as the European settlers set up an educational system based on their worldview and paradigms. Can you talk a little bit about how that educational system was used historically as a weapon against indigenous peoples in the U.S.? So I'm thinking about things like in 1864, Congress made it illegal for Native Americans to be taught in their native languages. And then we know that Native children were often taken from their parents and sent to boarding schools run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So anything you can share with us about some of that history of the use of Western educational systems as a form of colonization?
Yeah. See, the thing was, when Europeans for a long time had this formal education and so forth for quite a few centuries, and to a large extent, the educated, for instance, was the church. Mm-hmm. And they brought this over. Almost in a missionary sense, in that they were going to come and proselytize, convert these Native Americans. And it seems to me, without really saying it out loud too often, it was, let's see if we can educate and proselytize, brainwash the younger people. Mm-hmm. And that's why the prohibition of native languages came into existence and so on. The formal education system came into existence as a way of brainwashing the younger generation. Mm-hmm. And to a large extent, that's still going on. That's still the process. Mm-hmm. Except today, there is now a large, number of Native Americans that are realizing that, hey, this system of education is not working. There's nothing in it that I can relate to because it's not talking about my history, my culture, my knowledge, and so on. It doesn't talk about any of that. So, there's more and more of a push by the Native politicians for inclusion of, Native knowledge, Native history, Native customs, Native philosophy into the existing schools. And to a large extent, coming back to the Europeans, the thinking to a large extent was that there was, what did Native people know? and their knowledge, really doesn't contribute much to the existing human knowledge in the world. Well, now they're finding out, hey, maybe these people do know something, because we have elders, and I've seen them, and because I've been in them. Hey, elders talking with quantum physicists, because hey, some of the thinking in quantum physics is very similar to that native mind, to those native paradigms. Like we talk about what I refer to as constant flux. Well, David Bohm, a very famous physicist who passed away, but still very well known, he talks about the implicate order, which is the flux. The physicists generally talk about constant motion, which is similar to the flux, And so there's these similarities in native thought that are very similar. There's similarities with quantum physics and so on. And so now people, especially the scientists, are starting to, pay attention. And so it seems like there's an implicit recognition of that. And so you're starting to see throughout the country, just about every university has some kind of native program, a native studies, and they're popping up all over the place. And to me, that's an implicit recognition that, hey, there is some worth in Native American knowledge. What's the word? Axiology. Axiology speaks to the worth and value of what's being taught. And that seems to be, that axiology of Native American knowledge seems to be coming to the fore.
Okay. You were referencing a little earlier the situation for Indigenous children currently. What kind of schools do Indigenous children typically attend these days, and who is controlling those schools? Part of where I'm going with this question also is again, this whole sort of agenda, dominant narrative about education around high-stakes testing and standardization and how that all is impacting them.
Yeah. Well, the thing was, if we go back, let's say 100, 150 years, those first boarding schools here in Canada, they're referred to as residential schools. Those boarding schools, well, of course, the government and in many cases, religious dominations ended up controlling the schools and so on. But the tide is changing so that now more and more of the schools, especially on the reservations, are controlled by the tribes themselves. And now, slow but sure, there are starting to be a little bit more inclusion in the public school system of Native history and so on, but not very much. But it's starting to make a little bit of an appearance, so to speak. So that, for instance, in the province of Saskatchewan here in Canada, in high school, they are required courses, and they do have Native Studies courses in high school in the province of Saskatchewan. And, in the States, I take it there's the odd, school here and there in the public school system off the reservation that are starting to include a little bit more and more. But there's a whole lot more control of the education and curriculum on the reservation schools.
Sure.
And so the students themselves end up becoming taught a little bit about their own history, but then are also taught, the basic 3 R's, because most reservations, most tribes want to be able to make sure that what is taught in the reservation schools is also transferable to the public school system, because if students want to, transfer and so on, hey, they don't want to be held up. See, so it becomes a situation where they're doing both. But that's a very good thing, because by doing both, in other words, getting a native education and a Western education, they get a more a fuller picture of the total situation.
Right. When I was preparing for this interview, I looked at a couple of talks you did. I can't remember which one it was in, but there was a story that I just loved, and I want to ask you to repeat it if you recall it. I don't even know how old this talk was, but you were telling the story of a boy named Moses who was asked about the capital of Canada in class, and no one would answer the question.
Right.
Can you share that story with listeners? I just thought that was a really powerful story.
Yeah. The story was that, and it must have been, I can't remember exactly what grade, so it was maybe grade 3, 4, or maybe even grade 2. But we were going through a lesson where we were learning about the capital cities of the different provinces in Canada. Okay, and also learning about the provinces themselves and so on. And it was at the end of the lesson that the teacher says to the class, well, let's see what we have learned. Okay, so Moses, who is a friend of mine in school, was sitting in the front seat in the first row. And so she says to Moses, what's the capital city of Canada? And Moses never looked at the teacher and was looking up and down at the ceiling, down on the floor, saying kind of, humming, capital city of Canada is, and before Moses answered, teacher says next. And I was sitting behind Moses, and what popped in my head was, geez, this teacher is really rude, and this teacher is making my friend Moses look stupid in front of everybody. I don't think I'm going to answer for the teacher, even though I knew the answer, and I know Moses knew the answer, because we were talking about it outside during recess. And so when the teacher asked me, guess what I did? I did the same thing as Moses did. I never looked at the teachers, looking up at the ceiling, on the floor, and so on, saying, capital city of Canada is, and she says, next. Well, before you know it, the teacher went up and down the rows, never got an answer. And when I think back on that situation, I begin to say, geez, at first you would, you can kind of get angry at the teacher. But when I think back at, and think about it, I really pity the teacher, because the teacher had no idea about the dynamics, the social dynamics that were going on in the class. And it was all about relationships. Say, in the classroom, because all my relations comes into operation. And we would rather not make anybody look stupid or more intelligent than anybody else. So we prefer to all look dumb.
Mm-hmm.
And so at the end of the class, when the teacher couldn't get a response from anybody, even though probably most of, if not all of the students knew the answer, they decided, hey, we're not going to answer for this teacher. And so the teacher, not knowing what was going on, says, well, okay, get your books out again and we'll repeat the lesson. Okay. And it was on the second round that you can begin to see all the students drawing, because this was now old hat, So you could see that kind of social dynamics at work, but not perceivable to the teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And it all goes back to this paradigm about all my relations,
Right.
the relational networks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, very powerful story. And, and again, I just reflect on how different that is than the whole concept of Western education is, based in competition and testing and who's getting the better scores. And just that's a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that.
Right.
Let me ask you, as you think about the future of public education in the United States, what is it that makes you most concerned, and what is it that makes you most hopeful?
What makes me, really concerned is this singularity approach to education. And when I've talked about this at the university level, in advanced education and higher education. Mm-hmm. And that is, if you stop and think about the resistance of Native American knowledge in, in the university, the resistance to Native American knowledge in the universities, even though there's now inroads being made, Western education, at least at the university level, is not really about knowledge. Mm-hmm. See, universities used to be about knowledge, but more and more they're not really about knowledge anymore. Why? Well, because you ask any student that's going to university, ask them, why are you coming to university? Probably 90% of them are going to say, at the end of my 4 years over here, I want a job.
For sure.
Yeah. Say, in other words, they're coming to university to get a job. Mm-hmm. And my response to them is, universities are not about jobs. Mm-hmm. Universities are about knowledge. The fact that universities, are being questioned because they're about knowledge, the general public gets impatient, and they say, more or less say to the universities, geez, if there's so much knowledge behind those concrete walls, what benefit is it to us out here in the public? Well, in response to the ivory tower accusations of universities, they have said, okay, we'll do something that is going to be of immediate benefit to you. And that is, we'll turn out doctors, we'll turn out lawyers, we'll turn out engineers, and so on. In other words, the professional schools, mm-hmm. that will be of immediate benefit to you. But in the meantime, leave us alone. We want to be, we want to continue pursuing this notion of knowledge. Mm-hmm. See, however, that's starting to, waver a little bit, and universities are becoming more and more like tech schools.
Yes.
Because tech schools prepare students for a job, and they do a good job of it. That's their trade.
Mm-hmm.
See, now the thing is, what the universities are defending is not knowledge; it is methodology.
Mm-hmm.
How do we do things? How do we, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
It's really Western methodology that they're defending,
Yes.
not the knowledge, because they're really not about knowledge anymore. So what they put up as a hurdle to be, jumped over is Western methodology.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the universities are, defending nowadays. Whereas in the native world, it is about knowledge, because if you can think about this flux, constant motion way of thinking, one person once put it this way: we're always surfing the flux, just like the ocean waves, and so on, because things are always forever changing, and we're trying to find regular patterns. Once we find those regular patterns, even though there's going to be a change in them down the road, hey, at least temporarily we can hang our hat on them, because they can be temporary reference points.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So the thing is, it's always searching for knowledge, new knowledge in that flux. Okay? Whereas universities nowadays are always really about methodology.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, in other words, it's a custom. It's
Yes.
the accepted way of doing things.
Yes.
That's a big difference in public education today between Western ways of doing things and what a Native American approach would be all about.
Mm-hmm. What makes you most hopeful about the future of public education?
Well, I'm hopeful because it's almost as though the native knowledge and the native ways of coming to know are starting to surface. And like I was saying, without recognizing it, implicitly universities are, starting to recognize that, in the sense that, hey, native studies, for instance, are popping up all over the place. There are now native universities, for instance, in existence, and that acceptance in the universities is really something that, that makes me hopeful. The fact that, physics, quantum physics thinking is now being discovered as being similar to native ways of thinking. Hey, the scientists are starting to, hey, maybe we can look at science from a different angle, because the scientists are starting to say, our present ways of doing things, our present methodologies all they're doing is raising more questions. They're not giving us answers.
Mm-hmm.
So if we wanted to be a little bit more scientific and technical, in areas such as supersymmetry, hey, supersymmetry has not been proven in science. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
There's this notion about a Higgs particle. The Higgs particle in quantum physics is about the transformation of energy into matter. And they think that there is a particle somewhere in between that does the transforming. But they have not been able to really nail it down. From a native point of view, the Higgs particle really is about transformation, arising out of that flux way of thinking. So realizations of those kind of similarities, that kind of Native American knowledge, is what makes me really hopeful for the future.
All right. Is there anything else that you want to address that we have uncovered today?
Let's make it happen sooner than later.
All right. Well said. So our guest today has been Dr. Leroy Littlebear, a member of the Blackfoot Confederacy. Dr. Littlebear is the former director of the American Indian Program at Harvard University and professor emeritus of Native American Studies at the University of Lethbridge in Canada, where he was department chair for 25 years. He has served as legal and constitutional advisor to the Assembly of First Nations and has served on many influential committees, commissions, and boards dealing with First Nations issues. And Leroy Littlebear, thank you so much for sharing your just incredible wealth of insight, your wisdom, and your inspiration with us today.
Well, I want to thank you for inviting me on to your show, and, I'm very honored by that.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, we are honored as well. Thank you so much.